I did have a number of issues that went up to President Obama. And I'll just tell you, first of all, it's like, to me, it's always, and I still remember them, it was surreal when you had a, meeting like that where it would be with the president. And one of the most unbelievable things about it, from my personal view, was how prepared he was for every issue, given the scale of what he was managing and the depth of what we were covering. It was absolutely unbelievable.
Cash flow. Cash flow. Did you clear your cash flow?
Well, I'm really excited to chat with you today. Really interesting. A lot of SaaS people in the privacy space come from a tech background. And I think, you have a really interesting perspective because you're innovating the privacy, specifically privacy compliance industry from a SaaS perspective. But really interestingly, I mean, you served on the Obama administration. You were the Secretary of Economic Affairs, got really involved in some of these legislations that are governing how companies use data. So it's just like a really interesting intersection that you're at, kind of between both the tech side and the legislation side. I'd love to just dive more into that, Justin.
Yeah, Brian, first of all, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's a phenomenally interesting and really fast developing area, privacy and data protection. You're right that I was very lucky to have served under President Obama, I led the Economic and Statistics Administration. So it's one of our major economic bureaus. But I was also lucky enough to lead a lot of the negotiations around the world on data privacy issues like GDPR and how data is transferred. So yeah, that background gave me a lot of insight about what's going on around the world on privacy and data protection. And that's what really led to founding the company. And it's been terrific, really.
That's awesome. I know, like in the tech space, I'm sure you hear this all the time, being in the place that you're at, but like there's this concept that legislators don't understand what they're legislating. Like they don't understand the real issues. They don't understand how these companies operate or, how the data works, and they're creating regulations for good reason. Like there's an important, underlying reason to have these guardrails so that, companies don't do things that, would be questionable or unethical. But, the legislation sometimes itself can create problems. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hear this a lot, and I'd say there's certain things that not only legislators, like 90% of the people that we work with don't really have an understanding of. And, ad tech, for example, modern ad tech technology and how the real-time bidding works and how you see an ad. Most of the people, Brian, that we work with say that it takes 1 to 2 years in the space to really understand how real-time advertising works. But what people do realize, and what they do, I think legislators and everybody agrees with, is that they're really uncomfortable with the idea that they don't know where their data is going. People don't understand what data is shared with whom and for what purpose. They don't understand, once it's shared with somebody else or some other party, how they can get it back, how they can prevent its use. And I think that big picture discomfort is really what I see driving a lot of the legislation around the country on privacy. If I may, I'll give you a basic example. When you look at what California is doing right now, Brian, they're really leading across the country on thinking about advertising and marketing technology. And one of the first things that they did is they focused on this issue that when you and I land on a website, whether you agree to it or not, data about you or your device is shared directly from many consumer-facing websites with third-party advertising platforms, major social media networks. And you have virtually no control over that. And if you decided you didn't want that to happen, you can't stop it. Both of those things bother a lot of people. Why should my IP address and the fact that I visited a shoe company website, why should that be shared with a social media network so that I get an ad about that shoe company when I didn't even know that that was going to happen? And if I decided I didn't want that to happen, there's no way to stop it. So they're starting with some very basic things that I think people are uncomfortable about. And I think that's how progress is really going to happen here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And have you seen like the Brave browser or, obviously I'm sure, DuckDuckGo and some of these sort of new tech platforms that are coming up around the privacy issue. Your platform, let's dive into that next. WireWheel, your platform is for the enterprises to implement these privacy compliance solutions at scale so that it embeds right into, and I'm kind of paraphrasing your marketing, and maybe you can get more into the details of it. But your platform implements at the application level of these enterprises to essentially meet the compliance and regulatory standards of all of these different these CCPAs and GDPRs and all these frameworks that are coming up quite rapidly. That quite frankly, companies don't really know 100% what to do with.
Yeah, first of all, you've pointed out some things that are happening just in browsers. So right now, one technology that I'd recommend every company just start looking at is the global privacy control. This is a new protocol that California is requiring and soon will be required under other state laws like Colorado, Brian. And it's supported in browsers like Brave and DuckDuckGo and Firefox natively. And what it allows you to do is go into your browser, you set a setting that says, I want to opt out on certain sharing of my data for advertising purposes. And California is saying, if you're a consumer website and you are sharing data for ad tech purposes, you have to be able to detect that opt out, even if somebody doesn't click a button. And you have to obey it, which means you don't share data out. So one of the things we're seeing that California, Colorado, and others are driving is trying to make it really easy on a consumer to set an opt-out on data sharing once and have every website recognize it without you having to do it over and over again.
Interesting. So I have a quick question on that, Justin,
Sure.
if we could double click on something there. So is that data sharing, or does that apply with like any capture of data? If somebody selects that global, what did you call it? Global.
It's called the global privacy control. Yep, exactly.
Global privacy control. So if a user selects that in their session, does that mean that the company cannot capture any data about the user?
That's a great question. So I'll talk about what happens now today, Brian, and then what's coming later.
Okay.
Today, only really California, and you've seen it at the bottom of some websites. They have that little thing that says, do not sell or share my data. You've seen that thing?
Yep.
They have one required choice that's in effect right now, and it's do not sell or share my data. And California has been quite clear, especially through some enforcement actions they've brought recently. There's a case against Sephora, if folks look it up, that if a company's sharing data with ad platforms for the purposes of surfacing an ad, measuring the performance of an ad, analytics, or even things like frequency capping, okay? So you're surfacing it to a social media platform, or you're sharing data with an analytics platform. And the benefits actually to the advertiser, because you're improving your ads, California says that's a sale of data, okay? And if somebody comes to your website, they have that global privacy control clicked, then you have to stop selling data, which means you have to stop that pixel from sharing data with the ad platforms. Okay. So if I were to then boil that all down right now, for most companies, this means if they have the global privacy control on, you need to stop that automated sharing of data with the ad platforms, as an example. Okay. But in the next 6 months, there are at least 9 to 19 different new choices coming under state law. Some in California, some in Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and Virginia. And different states have different choices that are much more like what you just said. So, for example, in some states, before you can collect and process fine-grained location data, somebody actually has to know about it and give you permission to do it at all. So if I were to simplify it for marketers around the country right now, if you have the Facebook pixel, the Google pixel, the Instagram pixel, you need to put something up pretty much right now that allows somebody to opt out of it. And you have to have a way that it blocks the pixel, and you have to way that it takes that opt out using the global privacy control.
Interesting. So here's another question I have about that. Every server captures access logs or, various server logs. A user hits a single page that's going to trigger, 50 to 100 HTTP requests to load the page, images, CSS, JavaScript, all that stuff, various AJAX calls. So that all that data stores IP address of the client. So the browser, the user's IP address requesting the data. Does that fall under that? Is that PII in that case, or? Well,
that's a great question. And the answer is probably not. Not because it's not, something that the customer should, treat without care. But there's two concepts here, okay? And maybe I'll boil it down for a marketing or website team. When somebody comes to a website, Brian, they know that their data is going to be used to give them a website bunch of content. Everybody knows that, right? You're showing up at the web page, you actually want to get certain content, and the content's going to be based a little bit on where you are. That's appropriate. I know it, you know it. That's not an issue, okay? The parts that are getting to be an issue is not necessarily the server exchanges going back and forth. It's other technologies that are actually tracking usage on the page that are much, much bigger issue. For example, there are certain technologies that actually are doing behavioral analytics when you land on a web page. So it's tracking everything you click on. You might have seen these. These are often used on web apps. They're sometimes on a web page, and they're tracking exactly what you click and what you were interested in. And all of that is not being used in the way that you think it might be. It might be being used because they want to improve the customer experience on their side, or they're trying to tailor better content. And the interesting thing about this one, Brian, is companies are currently being sued for using these behavioral analytics tools without telling somebody that they're doing it and without giving them a chance to turn it off under wiretap laws. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So some plaintiffs' law firms have started suing different consumer websites for using technologies that basically track your every click, because they're saying, hey, under state wiretap laws, even some federal wiretap laws, you can't record everything somebody does without telling them that you're doing it and getting permission to do it and allowing them to turn it off. So this is, I think, going to be another movement, which is it's one thing to share data with an ad platform for purposes of surfacing an ad. I think that's one whole thing. I think it's going to be another thing if you're doing behavioral analytics on the visitors and not giving them a chance to turn it off or telling them that it's happening. But in terms of the normal surfacing of an ad or a normal surfacing of content, that's usually less of an issue just because most people know that's what's actually happening.
That's really interesting. There's a lot of SaaS companies out there that are built around that sort of analytics, personalization data. There's, session analytics. There's tools that capture like playbacks of sessions to, help marketers improve the user experience, like you said. So that's quite disruptive, I think, to a lot of businesses, a lot of SaaS
Well, yeah,
companies.
and if you just do a few searches on those session recordings, just search for it and look for lawsuits, you're seeing these plaintiff lawsuits pop up. And I'd say we're at the early stage on these. I'm not trying to say, hey, it's always a problem, but there are just enough judges that are saying, hey, this may be okay. And the way the legal side works, Brian, is once a couple of judges say, hey, you can bring a lawsuit under those laws, they start popping up all over the place. So
Yeah,
I'd say
precedent.
this is early, but one area to pay a bit of attention to.
Yeah. I mean, the last round of that I saw was ADA compliance for websites. So
Yep.
websites that don't have, screen readers, that aren't optimized for screen readers. There's been a ton of lawsuits. There was a precedent set around what should be required under the, Americans for Disabilities Act.
Yep.
Specifically for accessing, public spaces. Websites are public spaces. And so there's been a lot of lawsuits. I've seen that big in trending in the news, and also spoken to some companies that have been targeted and had a lawsuit against them. So that's it. Kind of sounds like the next wave of that potentially, kind of coming after analytics and data platforms.
Yeah, I'd say if I were to say three key areas, okay, three key areas. First of all, as I said, if you're using any kind of pixel, third-party data sharing, and you're a consumer-facing brand, I would really recommend you put, and this is what our product does. You put it right up on the website. It has a client-side data layer. It has the global privacy control. You can get it up very, very quickly, and then you have a way for consumers to control it. Okay, that's a key thing, but that's under California law. There are two other areas that I'd say. One is healthcare. Any healthcare or healthcare provider, pharma, medical device. There are two recent things, Brian, that have brought focus to this. You remember there was a Supreme Court decision, it was obviously huge news, and it overruled Roe versus Wade. And this has brought really strict scrutiny all around the country on how healthcare data and advertising data from a health provider, and I mean pharma, I mean, insurers and others, that if that data is going from a website to a third-party service and you don't know it, you could put people who are trying to get different healthcare treatments at risk, okay, in some ways. So the FTC brought an enforcement action just last week against GoodRx. It's in the pharma space. And they made clear that the FTC is looking very carefully at data sharing from companies that have any healthcare data. And if you're in the healthcare, insurance, medical device, pharma space, that's really an area I would look at how you're sharing data from your websites and from your mobile apps, and make sure you have clear controls and notices in place for anybody that visit those sites. So I'd say it's consumer data sharing with third parties, healthcare, medical device under the GoodRx enforcement action. And there was a recent HHS bulletin on this as well. And then finally, any kind of behavioral analytics or session recording for, under some of those wiretap laws.
Interesting. Yeah, the GoodRx model has a lot of data baked into their business model, so that certainly makes sense. They might be the first, kind of looked at for these new regulations. So moving on, tell me, we've been really talking about websites and kind of like the marketing piece of data privacy. What WireWheel does? What percentage of that is this kind of like marketing website bucket, and then what percentage is everything else, and what is the everything else?
Yeah, we have three solutions for companies. The first is a universal consent and preference platform with easy consumer experiences that you can put up on websites, mobile apps, connected TV, and others, so that a company can manage consumer choices and control of their data no matter where they're marketing. we focused on it this way because over the last 10, 12, 15 years, almost a lot of brands have moved to much more an omni-channel strategy where you set up different websites or microsites or different ways to engage with customers. And if you just look at it very simply, if you don't get a global understanding of how consumers are making choices, then you end up putting that data all over the place and you can't figure out what you can do with anybody's data. So we built something that makes it very easy for consumer brands to bring it across brands and channels and to get this experience up on your websites, your microsites, and others very quickly. We're working with agencies and others, advertising agencies, to make sure we can help solve that problem. The second,
that's kind of what you're saying there is kind of two things. One, it gives you a centralized place that your data is stored, right? So that gives you your central point of truth. But then it also, when you have to deal with these privacy things, when a user asks to take my data out of your system, you don't have to go unwind like the 10 or 12 systems that it could be. It's like centralized, right? Is that a correct assessment?
That's exactly right. And why did we do this? Because marketers over the last 20 years, they buy different tools for different channels. If you are doing email marketing, you may have an email marketing tool. If you have a website, you have a website marketing tool. Loyalty programs, companies often build their own database, right? So what happens is they collect consumer choices in email, like those email opt-outs, they'll collect it in the email tool. They'll collect the website opt-outs in an opt-out tool. They'll collect the loyalty program choices in the loyalty tool, and nobody can see them. So centralizing it, making it accessible means you can market better, market more ethically. That's one key element. And the second is we had to build this for marketers. You have to build it so they can launch a microsite and embed it on the microsite in minutes. And that's part of our universal consent and preference solution. We also have partnerships and integrations with virtually every company in the marketing stack. So we integrate with Google Tag Manager, Telium, Segment for front-end management. And we have integrations with everything from Adobe, HubSpot, Salesforce, Marketo, Eloqua, Dynamics, so that you can use this information much more quickly. So this has been a huge area for us of investment. We're excited what we've built, but that's one of our three products. We have an enterprise-grade data subject access tool. It's called our Trust and Access Center, Brian. And this, you know how when you go to get your credit report, you can go to the credit agencies and they have to give you your credit report. You get a chance to correct it and update it and provide that information. That sort of model that applies to the credit agencies is spreading across the country in every one of these state laws. And it's put under the category of data subject access automation. And you say, why the heck is it called that? And it's because, believe it or not, in Europe, a person is called a data subject. Okay. They call them data subjects. And in the US, they call them consumers. That's the shorthand. Okay.
So it sounds like, if aliens were coming to Earth and they're, trying to come up with a name for it, it's like the data subject.
Exactly. So in the privacy world, when they're talking about a system that enables a company to allow you to make a request for your data, validate who you are, collect the data, make it human readable, get it back to you in encrypted form, that's what our product does. That's a DSAR product, data subject access system. And so we have a system, it's enterprise grade, you can use it, you can brand it, and we're proud of that offering too. And then we really started in the privacy operations management space. This is another thing that's coming up across the country. Think of this as a complement to a security operations center, and it's focused on helping companies understand for each of their major data systems that have personal data, you can sort of figure out what it is, how you're using it, and are you doing the right thing with that customer data. So that was our first offering, and that's called our Privacy Operations Manager.
Cool. It's a really interesting suite of products, and they're all obviously similar, but very different use cases across each of those. Where's the most action, as far as like where your resources are allocated, where the revenue is coming from, which products are your biggest and your smallest?
Yeah, I'd say by far the biggest growth area for us right now is our universal preference and consent center.
That's the
And it's
website
it's
integration
the
tool.
website. And if I'll just tell you, virtually every website in the United States that's marketing to consumers has to change if you're doing normal social media marketing or third-party data sharing. It has to change in the next 6-9 months. The scale of it is huge. Companies are just waking up to it. A lot of times we go in and the marketing teams will say, "Really?" And we'll say, "Yeah, I mean, really, you can wait, but the states are issuing hundreds of these enforcement notices. The FTC is enforcing this aggressively. And it's all based on a very simple principle. If you land on some brand's website and that website is sharing data with third parties, you should know it and you should be able to stop it if that data sharing is for purposes essentially of serving an ad to you. That's what it's based on. And most websites are just not meant and they're not built to give you that choice to sort of capture that.
Interesting. Yeah. So we talked in our last call, kind of in like the green room session. We talked about, I have an agency and we do a lot of web development. And so you've mentioned, kind of doing a demo at some point for our team. So I think this podcast episode, I'm just going to share it out to everyone in the team and have them check it out as like a first touch point, because I think it's certainly compelling to me. I can see how we can get ahead of this as an agency and advise our clients and, kind of get ahead of what changes are coming down the path and, be rather than waiting for, something to happen and be reactive, be proactive for companies. And I think a lot of marketing teams and agencies out there could probably do the same.
Yeah. And, if you want to see this in action, and I'm happy to show this here or another time, if you go to our WireWheel website, and I don't mean for this to be an ad, but just so that people can get a visual on it, instead of those old cookie pop-ups that interrupt the consumer experience, the states are looking for a little thing that's a your privacy choices center. When you click on it, you can go back and change your mind at any point. It needs to have a nice, clean UI that has the global privacy control built into it. And it should be the kind of thing that any consumer can find and decide what data shared. And as I said, right now, Brian, this is kind of a simple set of choices. But by next year, you're going to be able to control all kinds of things. Colorado, for example, has a required choice that you be able to decide whether you want a company to create a profile on you. And just think about that, right? Most people, when you land on their website, there's a progressive profile that's automatically created based on your device ID that then gets enhanced and re-identified. Well, Colorado's saying you get to make a choice for that not to happen. So these are the kinds of things that are coming that I think people are going to wake up to pretty quickly here over the next 6 months.
Yeah. I mean, think about how many businesses like HubSpot, for instance, completely, a lot of their products completely disrupted by that, that change there.
Yeah, I think, it does. For me, I think a lot of this is we try not to be, driving this by fear. We try to make sure people understand there's a real concern for human beings around the world when they don't have control over what data was collected about them, who it was shared with, and if they can't make any decisions about it. That's really what we see driving everything. There's two basic principles that, in my view, are driving most of the human being discomfort on this, as you were saying, Brian. The first is you go somewhere and you don't even know what was collected about your device. You have no idea where it was shared. You don't know for what purpose. And if you wanted it not to happen, there's no way for you to do that. That's a really uncomfortable place for everybody I know. Okay, that's just on websites. And then the second thing we see is really driving discomfort across the board is, let's say you actually create an account in an app, or you create an account on a web app, or you log in, and then data about you is used in ways that you don't really think are fair. You know what I mean? You show up to a website, you log into the product, they're recording everything you do, and let's say they use it to develop a new product that you had nothing to do with. that's where people seem to get really uncomfortable, about the use
Yeah, like a lot of
the data.
people, direct example of that on GitHub. GitHub launches GitHub Copilot, which is a chat. It's a GPT-3 powered code completion tool. It like integrates right into your integrated development environment. So if you use like VStudio, Visual Studio, or you use PHP Storm or whatever, it just integrates right in. You write comments, it kind of auto completes your code like in Gmail when you're typing a sentence, and it just suggests the rest of the sentence for you. It does that with your code. But the way they trained the model was that they just like consumed all the code open source on GitHub, which was from other developers. So basically, a bunch of developers were upset that like, all right, all this code that I put on GitHub to help the world and help GitHub and the GitHub community is now being consumed to make my job less, to basically make it easy, make my job less important. Like now it's being automated. Most of the developers I've talked to and the people on my team, they see it as a really great tool and they love using it. It's, it can make a developer 2 or 3 times more productive and they don't see it as a threat. But I have heard both sides of the argument, especially in like Twitter space, on Twitter and various discussion, forums. I've seen kind of the counter of that as to how it could be considered like what you're saying, the user's data essentially was used. Now they open sourced it. They put it on an open source license, I suppose, but it was kind of used in a way that maybe they didn't intend it would be used.
Yeah, that is spot on. And I think that's a great example. And you know what the funny thing is? If you actually, let's say GitHub or another company, if they were really open about this and they explained it at the first time they did the collection, that it may be used this way, and they found a way to tell you in a way that you really got what they were doing, and they told you if you do this, you might get the benefit out of it, people would probably agree. I mean, people
But
will
they
agree.
didn't know back then. I mean, GitHub's been around
Yeah.
for over a decade.
No, but that's exactly the point. So, the thing that makes people uncomfortable about things like this is even the company didn't know how it was going to use this data, right? There's another example that comes up in the privacy world quite a bit that's very similar to that. I'm not going to get it quite right because I haven't looked at this in a while, and I won't name the company. But they had a product, a very well-known company. They had a product where you uploaded or recorded your voice, and it was for one particular purpose. Let's say you would ask it a question and it would answer it, or it might help you, do something else. And it turned out all of those recordings were then used to make voice models for translation products for another product. That just seems right. It feels uncomfortable. If it was one thing, if everybody knew that's what they would do, but even the company didn't know that they were going to use the data that way. So I think your example is a perfect one. And I think it just comes down to the bottom line. If you're using data in a way that a person would not have really anticipated at the time they gave you their data, the company ought to think twice about doing that. That's not a great trust way.
It's interesting the way data is used, and the way like these companies use data helps and enriches our lives in some ways, and then it also can be questionable in other ways. Like I saw someone did this on Reddit. They basically, Google Maps data. You can get traffic on real-time traffic updates on Google Maps, and it'll reroute your route based on traffic patterns. But I saw someone tricked Google Maps. Basically, they took like 200 phones and put them in a wheelbarrow and just walked slowly down the street. There's not a single car on the street, but Google Maps reporting it as like 20-minute delays, and the street's all red and gridlocked, and it's just 20 phones in a wheelbarrow being like pushed, half a mile an hour down the street. But who you don't think about that your phone's just constantly sending traffic data to Google like every second, updating it on the speed it's moving and its GPS positioning. Like all that data needs to be going to Google for Google to be able to give that experience back to the user in terms of real-time traffic patterns.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, there's some really interesting, productive ways that companies are trying to build communities and gathering your information as a first party, and they can build trust and you can get value. Like, for example, if you go to a lot of banking websites right now, they're giving away free advice on things people actually care about, like what's the best way to buy a home? What are the best ways to save for your education? These are things that you might have paid for historically, okay? And in exchange for that, they're asking for you to log in and for them to gain information about you. And some people will knowingly make that choice. I mean, you could buy a service or you could use and join this community, and you know that you're giving them certain information. I, for example, when I'm engaging, sort of working or going to a website that's effectively a retail media network right now, Brian, I honestly go there. I know that if I search for something, and I know that if I see similar items, I know they're going to use my data to market to me and for other purposes. But I actually want to know what people who like this book, what other books they may like, right? I'm making that choice knowingly. I think the out of home advertising stuff, if you've seen that, is really interesting. I mean, these are companies that are, for example, surfacing ads on out of house billboards, but they're combining advertising with your location data and your device so that you might see more ads for certain things if it relates to an ad you saw on a billboard. These are important concepts for people to understand. I think these are going to be the trends. And our goal is to make that marketing as transparent and ethical and understandable for the consumers so that they can make choices that we help the companies gather, and then we help the companies obey them the best way we can. And that's how we're thinking about it.
There's always in like sci-fi and Black Mirror and all these kind of like dystopian future, sort of movies or TV shows or whatever, books, content. There's this concept of like the future is so, the data is just so like it's so prevalent in governments and corporations and just, how the world works. I've seen examples where someone's like walking in a future dystopian world and the advertisements in a public space are updating based on facial recognition to that individual, data subject or person in real time, kind of like giving them personalized information that's likely to convert them. Do you think there's a future like that ever, or is that just?
I think that future's here. I don't know that we're not doing that. I mean,
we are to a watered down extent of the example I just gave, but yeah, it's
I mean, do you remember Total Recall, the Schwarzenegger version from like I think it was like 80s or 90s? I remember that. Like he was walking around town and different ads would come up, and I hope I'm remembering that right. But
it's been a while since I've seen that one.
Yeah, Minority Report. I remember like the Tom Cruise movie.
Exactly. Yeah, that was one I was thinking of.
Yeah. So I mean, but I don't think it's occurring exactly the way that it happened in those movies, but I think it's happening already. And I think as we get to that kind of granularity, I think you're going to start seeing personalized ads all over the place because it's possible to do. It really is. It's possible to do.
But we need these frameworks to kind of make it legit and not unethical.
Yeah, I mean, listen, just like you, we've all been looking at ChatGPT and generative AI very quickly. I don't think it takes a great leap to realize that very soon you're going to go to websites and you're going to get generative AI experiences based on very minimal information that you're presenting right when you land on the website and what your interactions are. So I think it's not only going to be what we saw in those movies, that brands and the ads are coming. I think you're going to get personalized generative content based on things that are known about you. So yeah, I think that a lot of that's coming. I think there is an obligation, in my view, for brands to try to make it easier. And I think one of the things that I think is a similar frustration for people is, let's say right now you think of your favorite brand, Brian, and let's say you decide for whatever reason you don't want to see ads from them anymore. Now, here's the question. Where do you go to make sure that you record that? Is it that brand's website? Is it the social media network? Is it the retail media network? Is it on your device? Is it on every device and your computer? Is it in your car? It's sort of like on a consumer right now to track down where the heck you tell somebody that you don't want the ads anymore. And that's probably not going to be defensible for very much longer. I don't think you can put it on the consumer or the data subject that they have to figure out where to go. So anyway, these are the things that we're really.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. I'm curious. I'm sure this is a totally loaded question and not an easy answer, but do these same requirements apply to government agencies as they do to corporate entities?
Yeah, are you saying like B2B versus B2C? Is that what you're?
No, like, so yeah, these consumer, these consumer, requirements for, like, say, Google's and Amazon's and any tech company for that matter that has to meet these growing regulations, like the one you talked about in Colorado, where companies can no longer create a profile on individuals without that consent being done. Does that apply to governments as well, or is this primarily to companies?
Right now, it's primarily, well, let me be specific. So GDPR, which is a European law, applies to all manner of entities and often to governments. Okay. But it's a regional, European regulation, which means that the countries and others have basically agreed that this should apply. Excuse me. In the United States, as you know, there's no national privacy law. So what's happening right now is there are state by state laws that are saying this is what's covered and this is what you have to do. Most of the things I've covered with you here today are coming out of state laws, and the state laws. You remember your history or government classes from years ago. States can't bind the federal government, so as a general matter, none of those laws apply to the federal government. And most of the states are accepting out of the law their own state governments, or even nonprofits are often exempted. So I'd say the coverage is a little bit state by state and regional in the United States, or sort of topical, whereas in other parts of the world, governments are covered too.
It has to be a federal thing at some point. Like, you can't just have this fragmented state by state thing just keep growing into a Frankenstein of legislation. It has to be federally mandated. And I think for people to trust it, it has to be upheld by the government themselves, right? Like, it has to be somewhat, equal to, for companies and governments to have to follow these regulations. Do you agree with that? Or is that?
I've written for years now about the need. I did an op-ed in Newsweek years ago about the need for a privacy law in the United States. I think it has to happen. I think it will happen eventually. It's hard to get this one. It's hard because there's so many people with so many different interests on this particular one. I do think when it happens, the federal government side of it and the state government side of it are going to be critical. Like, you can't have sort of governed collection by the federal government and have a real privacy law. I don't mean to suggest that's happening now. Like, even now, there's a lot of restrictions on government access to data here in the United States. But I think it'll happen eventually.
Cool. I have to ask you, otherwise the listeners will be upset with me, what it was like working with Obama. Did you work directly with him, and just kind of what was that whole thing like for you?
Yeah, well, first, so I was at the U.S. Commerce Department. So I was lucky enough to work with Secretary Penny Pritzker, and being part of that the Obama administration was one of the. I mean, it was a huge honor. I was I was incredibly lucky to get to serve under President Obama and Secretary Pritzker. I did have a number of issues that went up to President Obama. And I'll just tell you, first of all, it's like, to me, it's always, and I still remember them, it was surreal when you had a meeting like that where it would be with the president. And one of the most unbelievable things about it, from my personal view, was how prepared he was for every issue, given the scale of what he was managing and the depth of what we were covering. It was absolutely unbelievable. So I felt lucky that we had somebody in the seat then that was so thoughtful about the issues. I've heard the same things about President Biden in terms of just a really thoughtful, prepared, like, doing everything you can to do the right thing approach. And yeah, it was incredibly lucky. I don't know another way to put it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've never had the honor of meeting him, but he was an unbelievably charismatic and just like the way he spoke. He was just so believable, so relatable, and like you said, just so prepared, so articulate with his words, and that always struck me. Just kind of hearing him speak about any issue, but. That's awesome. This has been a great episode. I'm excited for this to go up, Justin. Anything else?
Listen, it's been great being on. I really enjoyed it as well. Yeah, I think I'm excited to see where things go on both sides of this. And as I said, thank you very much for having me on.
Likewise. All right. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thanks again.